It's easy. If you're a football coach, it's the number of wins. If you're a businessman, did you make money? In other areas, it might be more difficult because you might have to define what you're trying to do. If you're a broadcaster, you may say, well, it's the number of people who watch the show. It's the number of views that we got. But there's a little bit more difficulty there because you're not just about getting views, you're about getting advertisers, and so you have to keep them happy as well. There's a little bit more difficulty. In some things, it's easy, and some things it's harder. But what about in church work? In church ministry, how do you define success? In our scripture reading this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, we might have a good definition. Here as Paul writes the way he wants to be regarded, why he wants to be thought of, he says, as a servant of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. First and foremost, he says, I'm that servant of Christ. He is the one that I'm seeking to please. But also, in doing so, I am a steward of the mysteries of God. That's a word that we may not be familiar with. What is a steward? A steward is essentially somebody who's given responsibility of taking care of something that is someone else's. You have a responsibility of overseeing, of taking care of dealing with something that's not your own. We are stewards of the mysteries of God. And here he defines how that steward is successful. That a steward is found trustworthy. You may have that translated as faithful. They're the same word in the original language. A steward is found to be trustworthy, to be faithful. They are doing the job that needs to be done. They are taking care of the responsibility that has been allotted to them. They are taking care of that thing that's been placed in their hands to hold and to be responsible for. We need to be found faithful in doing the work of God. If we want to consider success in ministry, probably there's no better example than that of Paul. When we look at the Apostle Paul and we see how his work within spreading the gospel to the world and how he built up the churches, of how, if you want to find success, it would be Paul, right? So today I want to look at what Paul has to say about his ministry, specifically in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 12. If you have your Bibles, open up to that passage. That's where we're going to be looking at today. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. He starts there in verse 1 by saying, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain." You see, vain would be the opposite of success. Something that's vain is empty, it's meaningless. Paul says our coming to you was not in vain. It wasn't something that we were doing, but at the end we said, what was the point? But rather, he says it wasn't in vain. He said, but we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know, and had the boldness of God to speak to you the gospel amid much opposition. You see, here Paul doesn't define his success there as things were going easy, right? Things were going well. Sometimes that's how we think of it in churches. Success is, well, everything is calm and good. That may not be the case. Paul says they come to me in much opposition, in great mistreatment and suffering. Maybe we have our metric wrong. Because Paul said it wasn't in vain even though these things were happening. Success isn't ease, it isn't simplicity, he said in all these things, in these sufferings, we prove not to be in vain. Success isn't ease. Sometimes that's what we're seeking, ease, and what ease often does to us is make us unsuccessful, lazy, complacent. But for Paul, it wasn't found in ease because he says, you know the things we have suffered, you know the opposition that we faced. But then Paul begins to define success, and he first starts by saying that idea of faithfulness, being good stewards, because success requires conviction. It's being like a faithful steward. Notice what he says in verse 4. Just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. We were entrusted with the gospel. That's that stewardship, that faithful steward that we talked about earlier. That his mindset, his job as he was convicted, this is what I must do. I must find myself that faithful steward. It wasn't about just what he did, but it was also how he did it. Look at verse 3. He said, "For our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit." He said, our work, our exhortation, our effort is not about error or impurity or by way of deceit. You know, sometimes we will try to cheat our way to success. Sometimes in churches we'll say success is about numbers, so we'll just do anything to bring up our numbers. Sometimes we'll say success is just about happiness, so we'll just do whatever makes us happy. But he said our exhortation did not come by error or deceit, but we were entrusted, what? Entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, as he says, not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. He said our job was not to please men, not to please others, or just to please ourselves. You know, sometimes we say that. We don't want to seek to please men, and we exclude ourselves from that. Well, we're not going to make anybody else happy, but we are going to try to make ourselves happy. Are we still working to just please men? No, he said, but God who examines our heart, God sees and knows what we're really doing. He said in verse 5, "For we never came with flattering speech, as you know, or a pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others. Even though as apostles of Christ, we might have asserted our authority." He said, we came not pleasing men. We came not just in talk, that flattering speech. You know, some people will talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, they don't really do something. He said, we didn't come to get something out of you, that pretext for greed. You know, sometimes all it's about is getting something out of somebody. That's what Paul said. That's not why we did what we did. Not to seek glory from men, not to just have someone praise us, or to have the crowd think highly of us, make our reputation. No, he came to please God. Paul would say in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, "From now am I seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, then I would not be a bondservant of Christ." Success requires conviction. A faithful steward must know that his responsibility utmost is to the one who owns what he's been given. As servants of God, as stewards of the mystery of Christ, our ultimate success comes by pleasing God. Not pleasing ourselves or the crowd or our friends or our neighbors, but honest, sincere, seeking the will of God. Because success requires conviction. But success also requires compassion. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7, he says, "But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother cares for her own children," like a nursing mother, like a caring and concerned mother. You see, sometimes when people say, "I don't care what people think," what they're really saying is, "I don't care about people. I don't care about anybody else." But that's not what Paul said defined his successful ministry. No, he said, we proved to be gentle among you, caring, concerned. Notice what he says in verse 8, "Having so fond of affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives, because you recalled you have been very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, working night and day, not to be a burden to any of you, but proclaiming the gospel of God to you." Paul says here, he says, you know that we cared. And doesn't that make a difference? Don't we respond to people who really care about us? You know, he saw that success was caring about the people God cared about, to be gentle among you. That we cared enough to do the work, our labor and hardship, working night and day. You know, you can make people do something. You can bully them, you can yell at them, you can threaten them, and they'll do it, right? But only as long as you're around, right? As long as they're looking, because as soon as you walk off, they're not going to do that anymore. And sometimes we see that, say, oh, they're successful, but it falls apart rather quickly because the success is built on fear, right? It's built on a worry. But here he says, we proved to show what we cared for you because we gave our own lives. We worked hard day and night. Do we care enough to work hard? Anything that's going to have success requires hard work. It requires us to put effort and energy into it. Sometimes the things we label as impossible are not impossible or as much as we just don't care enough to make them possible. He said, but we proved to be gentle among you. That gentleness was because of our concern and care. Paul would say later in 2 Timothy chapter 24 and 25, the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, that perhaps God may grant the repentance leading to the knowledge of the truth. With gentleness correcting. You can't be getting in a fight with everybody. You have to be gentle and caring and concerning. Successful ministry requires us to have compassion. A caring compassion that does what is right the right way. And it also requires us to be consistent. Like a caring father. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11. He says, just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you, just as a father would his own children. Earlier he talked about the compassion of the mother, but here he also talks about that father who would raise his kids, who would discipline them, who would bring them up correctly. It's interesting because he uses three phrases here: exhorting, encouraging, and imploring. If you look at these three words in the original Greek language, they are very, very visual words. They are putting your arm around. They are poking you with a stick, right? They are pulling you up. I mean, all of them, when you read those words, there's a visual that goes along with them. And I think that is completely intentional by Paul here. Because notice in this passage, he's not just talking about what they will say to someone, but how they would show it. The idea of they would be coaching, they would be building them up, making them better. You look at the previous verse in verse 10, he says, you, as witnesses, so as God, we devotedly and uprightly or blamelessly as we behave towards you believers. He says, you saw how we acted. You saw what we did. You saw how we behaved towards you. That compassion that they showed, that conviction that they showed. He said, you saw it lived and breathed in your own lives. You saw our example. And then he goes to that 2 verses to verse 12 and says, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and to his own glory. Notice here, you're like a caring father. Father who knows his children are looking up to him. A father who knows he has to raise those kids right. He has to teach them and admonish them and discipline them when they need it. But he's there for them. He's consistently there for them. I mean, we can look in our society today, and as we have seen the decline of fathers in our society, and we can see the damage that it's doing to our world. Why we don't have the discipline that we should. Why don't we don't have the convictions that we should? Why we don't have the consistent we should? It can be related to lack of the role of the father. But the same thing is true in our ministry. We must have that example. We must live so that they can walk worthy of the manner because they walk in the way that we walk. It was once said that people will hear what you say, but they will follow what you do. Why was Paul successful? Because they saw what he did. They saw how he lived. They saw how he suffered. And they saw how he continued. No matter what struggles came up, they didn't just take their ball and go home. No, he continued serving faithfully, leading in that example, imploring, encouraging, building up. Why? Because they were like his children, like a father would his own children. Success requires consistency. We can't just say, well, I want to be successful, and for a moment we try and then we don't later. We have to be consistent. We have to be consistent in caring. We show that people matter. And we're consistent, we're caring, but we're also convicted that we are going to faithfully follow what God says. Now, you might be at this point in Lessing saying, Barry, I agree with you, that sounds all great, but you're talking to preachers, you're talking to elders, you're talking to deacons, right? I am not a church minister. But you're wrong, because you are in ministry. If you are a member of the Lord's church, you are in ministry. If you are here today, you are in ministry. Ministry, in the simplest sense of the original word, is service. It is the word that's used to describe servants of the church, deacons, in a special role. It's used to describe certain specific ministries, preaching and teaching. But in its essence, it's service. It's whatever we do as servants of Christ. And every one of us, no matter whether we have an office, a role, or whatever, should be servants of Christ. And if we are servants of Christ, we have a ministry to perform. And we have talents and abilities that have been given to us. And we must use those faithfully. As servants of Christ and stewards of the gospel. Paul would write in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 17 to a specific individual, Archippus. And he says in that passage, say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received, that you may fulfill it. We don't have any backstory on what he's saying to this man. We don't know what Archippus did. We don't know what he was involved in. He might have been a preacher. He might have been a teacher. He might have just been the guy that took care of the facilities. We don't know what Archippus did, but we do know what he was told. Take heed. Pay attention. Make sure of the ministry which you have received from the Lord. Archippus, you have a ministry. You have a responsibility. You are a steward. Make sure that what God has given you, what you have received from the Lord, what God has placed in your hand and said, I want you to take care of, I want you to behold doing, that you're doing it. That you may fulfill it. You may complete it. You may take it to the end. Each of us has a ministry that we need to fulfill. Each of us has a stewardship. That God has placed in our hands a talent. That God has placed in our hands something to be used. Something to be used as His servants. What are we doing with it? Are we hiding it in the ground? Do we care enough? Are we convicted enough? Are we compassionate enough to serve others as the Lord has served us? Don't expect to stay on the day of judgment and hear, well done, good and faithful servant, if you haven't done anything well, if you've never been good, if you're not faithful, and you've never been a servant. Because if we want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, we must start by being a servant, by taking hold of our ministry, by doing so faithfully, consistently, by doing it good because we do good to others because of our compassion and our love, by making sure that we are doing it well, consistently, holding fast, being that example, showing ourselves, proving ourselves that we've taken a hold of the ministry that has been given to us. Moreover, it is found that stewards be found trustworthy. Can the Lord look at your life and say, you've done what you're supposed to do with what I've given you? Are we using our lives in His service? Are we seeking the favor of men, most likely the favor of ourselves? Are we seeking to serve others as God would serve them? Not just trying to be right, but to live right as an example. Behaving ourselves and walking in a manner worthy of the calling that we have received and helping others to do the same. Can we hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant? Have we been found faithful? Maybe today you find yourselves not faithful because you've never obeyed the commandments of Jesus Christ. Maybe today you realize that you need to start that walk in living for Him. It starts by putting your belief in Him, confessing those sins that are keeping you from Him, confessing His name, turning from those sins, being baptized into Christ to be part of that family, to take hold of that service that you are doing, and walking in the way that you should walk. Maybe today you find yourself on the wrong path. Maybe you're on the right path, but you're just sitting there. And you haven't been convicted. You haven't been committed. And you aren't keeping the faith. Maybe today it's time for you to start your journey of faith. Maybe today it's time for you to restart your journey of faith. Maybe today you need to put on Christ in baptism. Or maybe today as a Christian you need to come forward so your brothers and sisters can pray to you for you to help you to overcome the things that are in your way. We must be found faithful. Are we doing what we need to do? If you need to make a commitment today, we invite you to let that need be known right now while we stand and sing.